I'm just going to say a word of welcome to both of them and to all of you on behalf of course, the CEU, but also of the Democracy Institute in Budapest. So it's wonderful that we are doing a joint event here, and then Renata will announce the events taking place in Budapest at the end of today's discussion. And this is an event organized together with the European Forum Alpbach. So this is also a first of its kind. It's the first event that we organized jointly with Alpbach Forum. Andreas Streichel is away, so he's not here. So this is a warm welcome in his name as well. It's wonderful to have two speakers today, both of whom associated with the CEU for a long time in a variety of ways. Ivan Krastev's first two books, I think, appeared with the CEU Press, Shifting Obsessions on Anti-Corruption Politics, and then The Anti-American Century. So Ivan has a long association with the university and was in Budapest at the public policy school. Tom Carothers has been a visiting professor at the university when it was in Budapest and is currently a member of the advisory board of the DI. So welcome back, I should say. I think for both of you, it's the first time here in the CEU on the stage in Vienna. And with that, I give Renata the word. She'll introduce her and our guests and lead the discussion. So thank you very much for being with us this evening. And after the discussion, there are drinks around the corner.
Thank you very much, Shalini. The program promises that the conversation will introduce and compare right-wing illiberalism in the US and Europe. And I have the perfect conversation partners for this, because in addition to being leading authors on several aspects of the conundrum for the last two decades, they are also practitioners and have a very good sense of how democracy promotion might work and how it might actually fail. So Tom Carothers is a senior fellow and co-director of the Carnegie Endowment's Democracy, Conflict and Governance program. And I do know him from the way back when he taught democracy promotion and civil society related courses and in our human rights program. And Ivan Krastev to my left is the chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia, where many of my very good friends and collaborators work. And he also is a permanent fellow at the EVM in Vienna. Tom's latest edited book is on polarization and what this means for democracy. Ivan's latest book is what happens to Europe after the pandemic. So let me ask you both, because we are meant to travel from the US to Europe. What should we take away from the midterms in the US? We shouldn't be terribly afraid, apparently, because the red tide didn't come, but there is plenty of political violence that doesn't look very good, even on international TV. So let me go first to Tom and then to Ivan for this one.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back at CEU. This is the first time I've had a chance to visit CEU in Vienna, so it's a special pleasure to be here. And always good to be with Ivan on the stage and in a conversation, and with you also, Renata. The midterm elections in the United States represented a partial victory for democracy, but not, I think, a major shift that should make us feel complacent about the deeper challenge that democracy is facing in the United States. So the most important part of the midterms with respect to democratic institutions was the fact that the fairly pointed and in some ways systematic effort on the part of a number of people in the Republican Party to get control of electoral administration in a number of key states of the United States that will be crucial in the 2024 elections was turned back by voters in 6 or 7 states who did not vote for the position of called Secretary of State, or in some cases, governor candidates who would be responsible for overseeing the electoral administration or appointing the people. So those people who are quite extreme were defeated. That's a big victory. On the other hand, that's only a small victory when we look at the much larger picture. The larger picture here is we have a country which is divided between two sides who view each other as threats to democracy, refuse to cooperate with each other in any productive way. And one of those two sides believes that in order to survive electorally, it has to continue to try to make it difficult for people to vote, or it has to gerrymander the districting of institutions to maintain its control of either the House or the Senate or various state legislatures. So you have an increasingly calcified politics divided between two sides. And that path of calcification continues to only harden. And whether or not Donald Trump is the candidate for the Republicans in 2024, this process of a negative spiral of toxic polarization is continuing. And nothing in this election really turned us away from that path. So very good news with respect to specific control of electoral administration in certain states. But in my view, nothing really profoundly different with respect to the path of polarization that we're on. Knows much more than me. It's okay now? It's okay?
No.
Is it now better? Yeah. So my reading, which is of course less deeper than Tom's, is that our reaction to the American midterm elections is the reaction of a person who has a huge problem with his health, so basically high temperature, he feels very badly, and then he had a COVID test and it was negative. And he has the feeling that everything is fine. Nevertheless, that all the things are there. And there's 3 things that for me are critically important on this. One is, and for me, this makes a huge difference between the United States and many other places, Europe, for example, is a tolerance for violence. According to the opinion poll, 1/3 of the Republicans and 1/3 of Democrats believed that political violence is legitimate, basically, not to allow the other party to take control of the country. This tolerance of violence is very high. And in my view, this is something that these elections, in a certain way, also make it very clear, is that polarization is so big that almost there is no protest vote anymore. The second thing that I found kind of troubling is that while the Democrats in historical term achieved a lot, because normally midterm elections should end up with a much bigger victory for the party in the opposition, the Republican caucus has been changed also in a significant way. So for the first time, the Trump party is not simply the party of the voters. It, in many extent, became the party of many of the elected people in the Congress. But the third, and in my view, interesting from the future perspective, is that this is also the first elections in which the Republicans should ask themselves to what extent basically Trump is helping them to win or to lose. And this kind of a discourse about Trump as a 3-time loser, which is starting to appear, the major break between him and the Murdoch media, the major break between him and some of the big Republican donors, and thirdly, the major kind of a candidate which the other Republicans probably are ready to support with the new old governor of Florida. This is a new situation. But, and this is my last point, paradoxically, if Trump is going to lose in a primaries, one of the things it is going to happen is that, strangely enough, some of the issues for which he has been pushing are going to be normalized. before he's so much kind of an exceptional figure in many respects that you have the idea of abnormality. Suddenly, if you're going to have another Republican candidate which is going to get some of the agenda, this becomes the agenda of the Republican Party, which is not just personally Trump's agenda, but many of the things on which he was running. And for me, this is important because, in my view, America is very different than many other places because of the nature of its electoral system and the nature of the state. Because in America, with the Republican Party, you have a political party that in the last 20 years, only twice in a very exceptional situation, has won the majority of the popular vote on the presidential elections, while he's been able to elect presidents. And these strange relations in which you are minority, but at the same time minority that is winning elections, makes it very different than many other places.
Let me, if you don't mind, Renata, just come further. Once you get Ivan and I started, you're going to have to work to get a word in, but we'll make sure you do. And it takes me, Ivan, to what I'd like to say a little bit about differences between Europe and the United States with respect to right-wing illiberalism. You know, on the one hand, right-wing illiberalism kind of looks similar between the United States and Europe in a lot of very basic ways. If you look at the basic elements of the agenda on both sides of the Atlantic, you can see a lot of commonality. In the first place, nativism, anti-immigration, the idea that the nation is under threat by these outside forces and you need to keep them out and so forth. Second, a retraction of progressive, fighting against progressive ideas with respect to gender equality, LGBTQ plus rights, and other such things. Clearly, there's a lot of commonality there. Third, a certain kind of economic nationalism or protectionism, suspicion of quote, global capitalism and all of that. All of that, you know, if we're having a meeting of right-wing international here, we can all agree on those things. But there are big differences that I think we should focus on and think about what they mean. First, there are some differences just with respect to items on the agenda. We could all agree on those if we're here in Right Wing International. But some of the items that the Americans would put forward, Europeans would feel like, wow, I'm not sure I go with that. Let me mention a couple of them. But that gets us into a deeper difference between, I think, what right-wing illiberalism represents in the United States and what it represents in Europe. So bear with me, just take me a minute. First, in terms of items that if the Americans were to put forward on the agenda, they'd say, well, in Texas here, we're from the Texas delegation. In Texas, you can buy an automatic weapon, carry it on the street with no permit. You do not need a permit to carry this. You can just walk around the streets with your automatic weapon, and that's your right. You don't need to get any kind of permit or license to go out and buy an automatic rifle. Do you Sweden Democrats favor that? Probably not, would be my guess. Would any right-wing party in Europe favor that? Or the delegation from Nebraska might put forward the idea of abortion should not be permitted under any circumstances, including rape or incest. Absolute ban on abortion. You guys in favor of that over here? Third, climate change is a hoax. Humans do not drive climate change. The vast majority of Republican voters believe that climate change is not driven by human beings, and therefore humans should not take substantial policy measures. Do you over here in the Italian right or the Spanish right or the Swedish right agree with? Pretty soon, the Americans would be putting forward things that the Europeans would say, hold on there, I was with you on the anti-immigration, troubled by the LGBTQ issues as well, don't like this global capitalism, but you're going down a road that's weird, frankly, and strange. And if I asked actually each side, I said, you Americans over there, you conservatives, how many of you believe in human evolution? What percentage of Republican voters believe in human evolution? 19%. How many European conservatives believe in human evolution? More than that, I would guess. So something's different is going on. So let me, again, bear with me a bit. My view, and maybe this is just too long in the trenches of kind of living through the travails of American politics in recent years. What's going on with the rise of right-wing illiberalism in the United States is part of a very fundamental struggle in American politics that I would date here today just back to the 1960s, but you could go back to the 1930s, to the Civil War or back to the founding of the Republic. And that in the 1960s, a progressive wave swept across Western societies, a wave of inclusion, sort of progressive values with respect to the environment, women's rights, etc. In most of Europe, the center left and the center right kind of went along with it and accepted it and continued to differ over economic policy issues a bit, lean this way or that way, but no real big difference among them. In the United States, part of the society went with the civil rights movement, the progressive wave, environmentalism, feminism, but another part of the society said, no, this is not the America we want. And a fundamental battle emerged. Maybe because I'm of the age, some of my earliest memories are going to anti-Vietnam War demonstrations in San Francisco in 1965 and seeing a society in which there were 500,000 people demonstrating against the Vietnam War, but an equal number of Americans who felt people who were doing that were disloyal to the United States, were questioning the government, which they shouldn't be doing. America was already becoming fundamentally polarized in the 60s over a debate between the left and the right that was really quite angry and fundamental. And I remember, Ivan, in the 1990s and 2000s, you used to say, and I always found it quite persuasive at the time, and I still think it was right, that the problem with European politics was that it was so boring and low stakes that voters began to realize whoever they voted for, they'd get the same policies. And you talked about the rise of anti-systemic forces coming. And when you used to talk that way, I used to think that's not in the United States. The United States is still treating every election as though it is a referendum on what kind of America you want. You want progressive America or you want conservative America. Whereas Europe, as you said, the difference between center left and center right on environmental issues, on gender, and all of those things wasn't all that different. Now, in recent years, the last 10 or 20 years, there's been the rise of this European right as a result of nativist currents over, you have inclusion issues that have really surged to the fore. You have disillusionment with sort of the free trade model because of the stagnation of wages in Europe and economic problems. So you have the rise of an angry right, which is questioning the system in certain ways. But in the United States, we've been living this in a much deeper and more fundamental way for a very long time. And so I feel like because we're a two-party system in the United States, not a multi-party system, the issue in the United States is, can the battle for the soul of the conservative party between a moderate right and a very hardline right. It's a battle that took place in 1964 between Barry Goldwater and the people who wanted Nelson Rockefeller or others to run. And ever since, the Republican Party has had a struggle for the soul between the moderate right and the conservative right. And basically, over the last 60 years, the immoderate right has been winning. It certainly won big with the election of Ronald Reagan. Then it started to regain and to go further in the 1990s with Newt Gingrich. Tea Party movement formed, Donald Trump came along, but this is all part of the immoderation of the conservative spectrum side in the United States, which is now, this midterm election is just one more step in the winning of the soul of the conservative party by those forces. Trump is no longer essential to them because they can win, without Trump, because all of the candidates are part of the immoderate side. All of the serious candidates are part of that. And so when I see European friends and colleagues worried about the role of the Sweden Democrats in Sweden, what's going to happen with this new coalition in Italy, etc., around Western Europe, Northern Europe, Southern Europe, I think to myself, you're in a very different place in terms of what this represents in your country than what we are. We are in a fundamental struggle between two visions of America that are having a very hard time agreeing on being one political system that works together. When 75% of Republican voters regard the Democratic Party as a, quote, fundamental threat to America, and an equal number of Democrats regard the Republican Party as a fundamental threat to the country, and you're stuck in a two-party system, you have a problem on your hands. And I don't see that same problem in European countries.
I'm going to agree, but then I'm going to make several points because what you're saying is very interesting. It's true, but also the effect of illiberalism is slightly different. European Union, exactly because it is not a nation state, but it's a very kind of a complex machine of reconciling interests, is not based in a classical democratic legitimacy. It's much more dependent on the rule of law. As a result of it, the political polarization that America basically can survive with a kind of majority which is ready to constrain itself. In Europe, the crisis of the rule of law system and basically the growing mistrust towards any type of neutral institutions, and I see this as a major kind of a things happening everywhere. For example, even in Europe, there was a very interesting survey that colleagues from the Ebert Foundation, which are based in Vienna, did. It shows that even the voters of a moderate center, left, center, right parties are not going to punish their representatives if they're going to break certain type of a democratic norms, because they start more to believe that the biggest threat to democracy is the other party winning the elections. And there are particularly three institutions on the election process itself people are still ready to defend, but there's three things that people are not ready to defend much. One is media. There was a question basically, are you going to decide not to vote for certain candidate if this candidate is ready to constrain the freedom of media? And only 2% of Spain said, yeah. Suddenly, the problem of media is not going to mobilize defense of the freedom of media, because people more and more starts to see when they talk about the media, they talk about the media that they dislike. So it's not about the freedom of media, it's the freedom from media. You believe you're blaming media, the other media, for what they're doing. Courts. Normally, in many of the stories, people are saying rule of law, but, and of course, rule of law is very important on the level of institutions, but coming from where I'm coming, being Bulgarian, the trust in the justice system is extremely low, extremely low. So I'm saying this because paradoxically in European Union, all these illiberal parties, which are delegitimizing the rule of law, the media, the independence of the central bank, can become very consequential without being so intensive, exactly because of the structure of the EU. And in my view, here also there's three things that comes on the European side that are not so different, and probably, I hope I'm wrong, have a similar roots. One, and this is kind of my personal obsession, I really do believe that to a great extent, the far right is very much rooted in a demographic anxiety. You have a certain type of ethnic or political groups which basically believes that they're losing power, that they're losing numbers. And as a result of it, you start to think that this elections is the last elections. What struck me very much during the January 6 events in the United States, and this was also very strong during the 2016 campaign of President Trump, who said, if we're going to lose these elections, we are never going to win elections again, because then Democrats are going to open the borders, they're going to give a voting rights to all these migrants, and we're done. So you have this demographic determinism. And the idea of the last elections, in my view, is critically important, because democracy is based on the fact that no elections is the last elections. I could be wrong, but I always believe that democracy is based on two things. One, that when you're losing, you're not losing much. And secondly, that if you're losing now, you can win tomorrow. If you believe that this is last elections, if you believe that the government can elect its own people, this classical Brecht, that government is coming and they're going to give voting rights for 3 million Mexicans, and all these 3 million Mexicans are going to vote for the Democrats, and then never Republican is going to win the elections, which, by the way, is not true. We know that all these groups are voting very differently, including the Latino. But if you go with this idea, then you're having this, in my view, apocalyptic mindset, which is something that you can see on the far right, and this basically explains some of the intensity of the issues. Because the second, Tom, when you start talking about centrality, absolutely centrality about the gender issues, listen, where is the difference between the United States and Bulgaria? The difference is that in Bulgaria, we have 4 transgender persons in the country. But the issue is very high on the agenda. So in a certain way, it's a totally symbolic issue. You start to fear that the world is changing so fast and so much in the direction that you don't understand, that if you're not going to stop it now, tomorrow is going to be late. By the way, this you have also on the left with the climate issues. Absolutely the same type of apocalyptic story, that if we're not going to do it now, tomorrow it doesn't make sense. In my view, this is what is changing dramatically the way democracy functions. And this is my major thing, what I see in common. Democracy is very much preconditioned on the idea of a future as a normative horizon in which you can solve the problems of today. Future is very important because democracy is about promising things. It's so important. Probably you're not going even to fulfill the promise, but future is there. And in the future, certain things that exist today are going to be changed. Suddenly, this is not there anymore. If you believe that these elections are last elections, if you believe that if we're not going to do about the climate something today, in 3 days, you are not going to be in possibility to prevent this, then the whole nature of the political debate is changing, and the whole participation in politics is changing. In my view, this intensity coming from this kind of disappearance of the future as a normative horizons in which you function is changing the nature of democracy, regardless of the fact that there are so many other things which are different. And I totally very much agree with you that having somebody with the gun walking on the streets at least of Vienna is not easy to imagine.
Take this a little further, and I would very much like to speak eventually about the transmission belt of how some of American evangelical and pro-Trump ideas travel across the globe and how they transmogrify. And of course, Ivan knows full well that the absolute Bulgarian achievement is to put the culture wars and the gender issue in rule of law terms. So nobody ever managed that, but apparently gender versus sex is incompatible with Bulgarian rule of law, especially when understood in light of the Bulgarian Orthodox Church's social teaching. So, but that's just a footnote. To bring it back to something that's more consumable to ordinary mortals. So in light of what you were saying, what difference does the infrastructure of constitutional democracy make here? So on the one hand, we see people who very much work in gerrymandering, in intimidating voters. They also cry wolf way before the elections, saying, and that's a standard technique, that these elections will be stolen. It's always the incumbents lately who are absolutely sure about this. At the same time, in France, the second round of the presidential elections produced the lowest voter turnout in 1969, and allegedly the fate of democracy was at stake. And so we can, on the one hand, be very happy that Macron won, except that now he is fated to govern with the National Assembly, where he doesn't control the majority. Nobody controls the majority. Lula, the big Brazilian victory, also means a president who absolutely doesn't control the majority of Congress, and frankly, the majority of Congress is behind a guy who has been a member of almost every party on the opposite side of the spectrum, right? So, to what difference does the infrastructure of democracy make when the spoilers control and illiberal right-wing, often far-right actors control a fair bit of the infrastructure, way beyond veto place?
Well, I'm not sure that right-wing actors in the United States, I wouldn't say that the right-wing actors control so much as what you described, but I would highlight that electoral integrity and electoral access are a fundamental battleground in the United States. The United States is the only, quote, OECD democracy where the simple act of who gets to vote and how votes get counted is still a battleground and an issue. You know, when Canadians look at us, look southward, and look at how we run our elections and the amount of political combat that goes over whether or not somebody gets to vote or not, and who gets to count the elections and count the votes and certify and so forth, they already know that we're insane, but then they know that we're, certifiably insane. And if you look at how in the 1960s, I'm looking at a Canadian right there in front of me. If you look at how Canadians in the 1960s established a rational process for running elections and have held to it ever since, That's because the United States, as I said, has been in a fundamental political battle for a long time. In voting, it started with the civil rights movement in the United States, and it's about, and that goes back to earlier times in American history, voter access. The reason it's such a battle is because of the question of inclusion of race in American society. It's about whether or not Black people get to vote or not. And so the question of inclusiveness of democracy is a fundamental issue in the United States that has been since before the Civil War and to the founding of the Republic. And so that institution, democratic institution, has been a battleground throughout our history and is still today. People still argue about, can you give water to somebody standing in line to vote? Can this person vote if they don't have this identification or not, and so forth. And because many conservatives have come to see that, as Ivan says, they are having trouble winning the popular vote, and it's actually only one time in the last 34 years have the Republicans won the popular vote, in 2004, since 1988.
And it was a war, yeah.
And it was post 9/11. The Republicans have taken the issue of voter access and turned it into a larger cause, because in a way, the only way they can keep winning a lot of elections is by gerrymandering and limiting voting. The Democrats would control the House of Representatives today or after January if Florida had not gerrymandered its seats, and if the state of New York had succeeded in gerrymandering on the Democratic side, which was thrown out by a judge. And so it's only because of gerrymandering that Republicans managed even to win this House election in an off year. So the Republicans have their backs to the wall, and so they fight over the electoral institution itself. So the institutions of democracy are key. And then I'd say a second thing is we are stuck with a two-party system. If we didn't have a two-party, because of the electoral system and the winner-take-all and so forth, and if we didn't have a two-party system, it's possible that this battle for the soul of the conservatives would be, we just simply have two conservative parties, a further right party and a center right party. Then we'd have a center left party and a progressive party, and we'd have a lot of coalitions between the two parties in the middle, and it would be a bit like German politics has been, or some other European politics in recent decades. But we're stuck in the two-party system in a country with two competing conceptions of the country. And so those two competing conceptions get calcified into those two parties, and then the parties fight over the fundamental institutions. And that's why in the United States, the institutions are always under attack. Our institutions are under a continual assault. Donald Trump was only one of a number of people who, have led assaults on different kinds of institutions in American democracy.
Two things on this, and of course there is a lot of literature. The interesting paradox of the American democracy, and particularly the fact that you have a very divided politics from a very long time, but you have the idea of the bipartisan consensus on the government and Congress level, was based on the fact that the parties were very non-consistent. In the Democratic Party of the United States, till mid-1960s, on one and the same time, you basically have the liberals of the North and very, very conservative people on the South that have been basically functioning in the one-party systems, much more racist than anything that you can say about Hungary today. So why this was possible? You're voting for your candidate, and it goes, but in a certain way, you're not voting for a party. And one of the things that happened, and this is what American researchers are showing, that suddenly the American parties became much more ideological and consistent. So now when you're voting for the Republican Party, basically New York and Texas, you're going to have somebody that are not so far away in their understanding of what is going on. I'm saying this because in Europe, one of the assumptions was, and this was Renata's question, that the electoral system and the nature of the electoral system basically can explain what is happening in the United States and United Kingdom, and that if you have proportional representation and if you have much more a coalition type of government, this cannot happen. But I'm going to give you one country which, at least in my view, is very important to understand, particularly what is happening in Eastern Europe. I never bought for a minute that Vladimir Putin or Donald Trump can be a model for an East European leader. He is slightly more modest in our view of the world. But this country is Israel. This is a country with a very proportional system. At the same time, basically ended up as polarized, as you can see. And here's one of the story which I see more and more with this type of a turn. The connection between personalization and politicization of the system. Suddenly, the system is very much kind of structured around a very strong political personality. And this is the real dividing line in America. Very much Trump did it, but it was also in a bipolar system. In the case of Israel, it was, of course, Netanyahu. You can have it other places. Bulgaria is also an example about this. And this kind of a polarization allows even a very much kind of a coalition-minded electoral system to end it extremely, extremely polarized. Italy, and this is what I see as a common trend. Electoral system for sure affects. It affects how it's going to be represented or not. But in some of the countries, you can see that the small electoral partner in the coalition can radicalize the coalition dramatically. Poland is one example, but again, basically, if you're going to have a coalition with the religious Zionist party in Israel, which is very, very much more on the far than Netanyahu could be, it shows you that this is explains something different. How the right-wing agenda can become much more central, even when the votes of the right-wing parties are not as high as you can expect. And this is also some of the interesting questions about how you're thinking about Sweden Democrats or others. And this is two school of thoughts, and I don't believe that it's a general answer. Because one way is you can basically try to integrate some of these parties in the system because they represent certain sensibilities. On the other, that they can radicalize the agenda without winning the elections. They basically can make the agenda there. And my last point is very much about something that I found particularly interesting in the American case. In 1848, when the universal male suffrage came in France, there is a very famous poster of this period, which I always was in love with. And this was a worker who had a ballot in one hand and a rifle in the other. And the idea was a ballot for the class enemy and bullet for the national enemy. And this was the power of the war to try to create certain type of a political communities, and we know it very well, World War I and the vote of the Social Democrats in most of the European countries. What is striking in the American case is to what extent basically now you have the rifle for the internal enemy and probably ballot for the external one. Suddenly, the civil war situation of how you perceived who is the real enemy is pushing before President Putin is going to help the Democrats and the Republicans on the voting level to come together. So now much more basically the divide on Biden is bigger than the divide on Putin. So suddenly Republicans starts to like Putin more than disliking this. This, in my view, is new. And this is something that is changing very much politically, and I'm very much interested to what extent this is much more American or this is still part of a bigger divide that we see.
Well, I would be hesitant, Ivan, about putting too much emphasis on the electoral system as a driver of that kind of divide. And in the case of both Israel and the United States, I would say that the electoral system in the United States is definitely an aggravator of the problem. But in both Israel and the United States, I see is what's driving the divide is much more the identity issues that are sort of fundamental to the thinking of the society about itself. Israeli politics has shifted over the last 20 years. It hasn't, the power of the religious right has grown in certain ways, but in general, Israel as a political community has changed, and different ideas on the right have hardened into a much tougher ideology about what Israel could and should be, both as a society and as a neighbor to the countries around it. And that's what's driving the polarization in Israeli politics, is a toughening of this right of center view of what Israel is domestically and internationally. And in the United States, again, I feel that we have certain fundamental drivers of this polarization. And I point to at least two of them that are very deep, which are not shared in a lot of European countries. One is the anti-state versus pro-state view of many voters. Think of an American voter lying on his deathbed in a hospital who has COVID. He's dying because he refused to get the vaccine. And the doctor says to him, you know, if you gotten the vaccine, you wouldn't be here. And he says, at least I will die a free man because the government did not put that vaccine into my veins. That's an anti-state mindset that is so deep in American society among some people the book by Hochschild about strangers in a strange land. She goes out into the South in Louisiana and other places and looks at people who were poisoned by terrible corporate misbehavior of pollutants put into local communities through industrial plants and other things, and says again to people dying of different kinds of poisoning, don't you wish the federal government would come and at least regulate these companies? And say, I don't want the government here. I'll just die of my cancer. It comes from the poisoning from this factory, but the government doesn't, they have no business here. And so this is the anti-state view, or what's one of the first things the new Republican House is going to do when it takes power, once it starts investigating Hunter Biden? What's the second thing it's going to do? It's going to try to stop the funding by the Democrats for the Internal Revenue Service, because they don't want the Internal Revenue Service to have more power, because that is the fearsome state that's going to come and invade people's lives. And so this anti-state view is so deep that it's a divide in the country. When an American says to me over here, I want the elementary school teachers in our community to be armed and ready to kill, I think to myself, I don't want my kid to go to a school where the teachers are carrying a weapon around with them. Where they say, well, how else are you going to stop these terrible shooters? We got to arm the teachers. And I say, there's a different view of the role of the state here. Not, we don't have to accept this. And so all I'm trying to say is there are deep issues. And one is the state versus anti-state, and the second is religion and the role of religion. Again, so when the person says no exceptions for abortion in the case of rape or incest, because life begins at the moment of conception. I'm a religious person. I believe that. If you don't believe that, you're a heretic. And I'm going to pass a law and we're going to organize to make it so that you people can't do that. Again, if you want religion to play such a strong role in this society, and you have so many people who have a view of religion that's so different from other people, you've got a divide in the society that's in trouble. So last thing I'll say, sorry, give you a word, is when you said the source of the right in Europe in the last 20 years is anxiety about the nation and the society, and that, I think to myself, no, in the United States, the source of the divide is very deep and goes back to a founding of a republic over a federal versus a states' rights view, role of religion in the society and role of race. Ours isn't a new anxiety. These are old issues in the United States, which we've been playing out for 200 years. So they may be new to current European polities, but that's where I feel the right in Europe in some ways is very different from the right in the United States.
I agree very much. But for me, the most important, I do believe we go even deeper. And the problem is about natural world. For example, about the natural world. There was this story that in Bulgarian constitution, basically, we said that you cannot decide on your gender because you're born man or women. And this is quite important because suddenly, for a big group of people, the major threat is the world in which everything is a personal choice. And you start to believe that in this world, you cannot find a place for yourself, how everything can change. And by the way, change so quickly and so easily. And then you have all these people who said they're natural things. We should defend them. And this is an interesting story in this survey that made this why so strong impression on me on the Ebert Foundation. It appeared that economic issues don't play. And for me, this is very important. We know that European politics worked very well. And when basically the major divide was about economy, because on economy, you can reconcile. And particularly Austrian or German system, a classical example of this, how you negotiate about who is going to get what, when, and how. Suddenly, you start to talk about identity, but not simply identities, but identities in crisis. I'm fighting so much about Bulgarian identity because I'm not sure anymore what it means to be a Bulgarian. It's not a clash of civilization. This is a clash of crisis of civilizations. And all of them, and the moment I'm in this crisis, for example, the problem with religion, is it not funny that in a strange way, this religion story goes up in the United States when the number of the religious people is diminishing, and particularly in the younger generation, if you see the figures, you're going to see the churchgoers has dramatically declined. And by the way, this is the Polish story. In Poland, you have very, very strong figures how much less younger people go to church than before. And this is the fact that it is not simply identity politics, but this is the politics of a kind of a crisis of identities, and particularly some of the identities that have been taken for granted, and you don't know and what is going to happen and how far you can go. And this creates this strange story in which what struck me in this survey was that suddenly the gay marriage is becoming the most important how you decide is your country democracy or not. For the more liberal part of the population, you believe that if there is no gay marriage, your country is not a democracy because not everybody has an equal rights. For the conservatives, particularly in Eastern Europe, where the majority of the public is still critical to this, the story is a country cannot be a democracy if you have a certain rights which is not supported by the majority of the population. And here, this is quite interesting how differently people are treating rights that is a result of the political struggle and the rights that comes through the European integration of the court system. And this, in my view, is critically important. And this is why I totally agree that there's a major difference between the United States and the EU. At the same time, there is a lot of, probably Renata is going to talk about this, there is a lot of borrowing. This is very funny to see basically East European conservative, particularly Bulgarian, who has never been in church outside of the Easter, speaking the language of somebody who is not leaving the church. But this is borrowing of the language. But the thing that brings them together is this fear of a world in which kind of all the established identities are in crisis and everything should be a personal choice. And my last point is also the generational issues. When this type of a furor about the Istanbul Convention started in Bulgaria, and it came as a surprise to me. I was trying to understand why, because Bulgarian society is a very secular society. You're not going to explain this by the church. What you have in 1968, you have kind of the revolt of the children against the way of the life of the parents. Now you have the cultural revolt of the parents against the way of life of the children. You don't understand your children. Even more because of the new social media, your children are much more talking to each other, and intergenerational kind of a contacts are much more problematic in many respects. And as a result of it, all this combined, particularly in Eastern Europe, with the idea of a shrinking and declining population and the fear that my way of life is disappearing, my ethnic group is disappearing, this creates this totally strange from outside level of intensity which you cannot understand. Because in my view, what is changing in the democratic politics is intensity. This is why it starts to resemble the religious wars and this type of a politics based on passion. And for me, this was interesting because I totally agree with you. It's a different people, they have different motivations. For sure, some of these have been around in Europe too. But why they come up, why it's so easy to borrow, why you want to be a Trump supporter in Eastern Europe when you're so different otherwise. And this is, at least in my view, some of the answers.
Long answers. Let me put a riddle in ways where I connect some dots, and I hope to push or open up some further conversation, because the constitutional infrastructure does matter in certainly another way, especially in the US. You are on an accelerated trajectory of using impeachment as a political assassination tool, not so much finishing it, but charging it and putting political accountability and responsibility for conducting one's own self in office in terms of much higher stakes. That is, we are going to ban you from office, you personally, and so that kind of, so politics as a mutual assassination game is here supported by the institutional infrastructure. So institutional solutions, which were meant to be measures of last resort, become essentially replace policymaking and sensible spaces for politics. Very similarly, judicial decisions on basic political conflicts were not meant to be ordinary operations. Those were meant to be the exceptions. And because you litigate identity claims, because of the nature of the litigation, the very process, they have to be put as non-negotiables, which clash with each other. So, and that results a fair bit in further pernicious polarization. Now, in one of the studies on pernicious polarization, that actually Carnegie also published by Jennifer McCoy and Murat Sommer. What they are saying is that we know very little about depolarization in sort of mid-level tension scenarios when we are not after a war, a civil war, or a revolution. What we do know is that an international context that points towards depolarization, that points towards civilized politics and democratic ways of resolving our disagreements helps. And so this is why this is how the trajectories of transmission of identity politics and also nativist American politics matter a great deal, because it's not simply identity politics, but it's also a very strong sense of victimhood and the globalized sense of persecution. The Hungarian government runs on persecution of Christians in a country which is nominally Christian and nobody is persecuted. Where essentially the aim of the depersecution of strategy is to keep the Christians in Syria. And when you come where they are in danger, and then you come to well-funded projects such as the Geneva Consensus Declaration, which is a Trump administration attempt at redefining reproductive rights, protecting traditional family values, which is then matched by the Ordo Iuris plan to build a new convention to protect traditional family values. So we definitely see not only international trajectories, but also the building of new alliances. And I'm wondering how that affects any kind of depolarization strategy or wisdom that we used to know from before, and where does that put us for the future?
Let me, I don't want to avoid that question, but to get at it, I want to go just one step back, and I want to talk about what you say, Ivan, I think is crucial, and we all feel it, is this intensification of politics. The intensification of the emotional dimension of politics in the last 10 years has been stunning. The level of the intensity of the language that's used, the feelings we have about politics in our own place, and you can say to yourselves, why this ratcheting up of intensity in so many places? It's not a side effect. It's like it's something at the core of what's happening. This is, a gross analysis, but I would say I think you've touched on one of them, which I'll come back to. But I think there are two big drivers in, again, the OECD democracies of intensification. One is fairly simple when we step back and look at it historically, but we seem to have been surprised by it, which is from the mid-1940s through the end of the 20th century, the wealthy democracies did pretty well economically. And the working class, the middle classes of these countries basically did pretty well for 50 years. Starting sometime in the 1990s, thanks to the way neoliberalism evolved, from the mid-1990s until now, the last 25 years, the middle classes have done pretty badly in Europe and the United States, both because of, a variety of reasons. So basically, wages have been stagnant, jobs have been outsourced, et cetera. And you have it's very hard to build a happy democracy on the back of economic stagnation. And there's a lot of people who are just very insecure in their economic life, and they're very angry at the elites for good reason, because they felt like, what happened to the 50 years before when my parents, they grew, and why am I going to be poorer than my parents, and so forth. So they're angry and they're vulnerable to all kinds of messages about whose fault that is and what we're going to do about it. So one is, you had 50 years of economic success in Western democracies, but it's been replaced by economic rising inequality and rising stagnation for the middle classes, broadly read. And then second, you have what you were saying, this both generational, but this idea of, in a sense, the values agenda having shifted, and a number of people feel like my way of life is changing, is being threatened in ways I'm not comfortable with and I don't understand. And this whole revanchism against gender equality, the expansion of rights and economic participation for women, against inclusion on sexuality issues and so forth, and against many elements of the progressive agenda, as you say, is both generational, but is some deeper sociocultural battle that's going on. You put those things together, the anger over economics, this battle over sociocultural values. You have politics, therefore, that are vulnerable to parties that represent the anger, that offer extreme solutions to it, but above all, that engage in intensity. They engage in combat, because these are fundamental things to be angry about. You're angry about your economic insecurity. You're angry about this question of identity, and the temperature ratchets up very quickly. We look at Brexit. The thing that stunned me about Brexit was not just that it happened, but was the British politics, which was actually fairly civilized, suddenly was incredibly angry. The level of anger in British politics about Brexit. I remember a parliament being killed. This is not the Britain that I knew in the 1980s and 90s. The language changed in British politics. The sort of nature of party politics changed in many ways, and because Brexit was those two sources of anxiety coming to the fore. Anger about the economic, Britain's doing pretty poorly economically. Middle classes feel like somebody's giving them a bad deal, so maybe it is Brussels. And then secondly, insecurity about immigration and the identity of Britain and what are we becoming as a nation. Put those two drivers together, and even Britain, boring Britain, you had an intensification of politics. So everywhere there are different specific sources of the intensification, particular dynamics, but these two big drivers in Western democracies shouldn't be a surprise to us in a way. So when we get to depolarization, depolarization isn't like, oh, this new thing I attached to my faucet that depolarizes my water. We've had a lot of debates, Jennifer and Murat, they're terrific researchers, and they're trying to write a book about depolarization. We've had a lot of conversations about, because you can use a word, is there such a thing? It's kind of like Wittgenstein turning over in his grave is, here, if you can say the word depolarization, that implies there's a thing, a process called depolarization. It may be there is no such thing. Find me an example of it. And so, what are the 5 case studies of democracies that were very polarized and then became less? Was it Italy under Berlusconi? Was it, you can sort of try to look around and you find very few, because actually this is the worst age of polarization. We haven't had since the 1930s the kind of, polarization that we're having now in Western democracies. And so depolarization, if you see these two big drivers of it, you think, this is a big task. This isn't going to be, let's just have a few community bridge building sessions where these people talk to these people and realize, hey, they're not so bad as I thought. Because in the US, when they've been having these sessions in many places, they come away saying, they're even worse than I thought. I hate these people. Like, I really hate them. It turns out you have to be very careful about holding such sessions, because people will come away from them even angrier. And so depolarization is profound, because what you're saying is, how do we ratchet down the temperature on these two fundamental insecurities? And what will it take in terms of policies that might make people feel like there's a consensus approach to solving these two problems?
Can I go on this? Because, of course, social media we didn't touch. There is a technological factor too. In order to be intensified, something should happen to you every day. And you can be, because of the social media. But for me, also, one thing that is really changing kind of quite dramatically is, and we're seeing when the other side is doing this and not when we're doing this. For example, when Trump was saying, block her, about Hillary Clinton. Funnily enough, the political campaigns more and more is not who you want to be in power, but who you want to be in prison. The major promise is that I'm going to put somebody in prison. Of course, in Bulgaria, we're overperforming, but I can see on this very much, but it comes on every kind of a campaign. And this is how democracy cannot work. Listen, if I can choose between staying in power or going to prison, believe me, I'll prefer to stay in power. And this is not simply that you have intensity, but the stakes are becoming high. And the problem is that democracy, in my view, cannot work in two occasions. When the stakes are too low, this was the example that you wanted. When you're changing the government, nothing is changing. You're changing people and nothing is changing. And then for you, democracy does not make sense. But democracy also does not make sense if the stakes are too high. If I'm going to change the government and it means that I'm going to end up in prison, I am going to think how important democracy is. And as a result of it, we'll end up with three types of different groups disappointed with democracy. One is, for example, Democrats who fear that Trump or Republicans are going to come. And there was this famous Plan F that it was discussed on January 15, that you're going to change the administration so big, you're going to so much reform the deep state that the other side is never going to be able to win. Then you basically have the Republicans fearing the Democrats will do the same. But you have then this 50% who are not voting. And these people start to fear that democracy is nothing more than just dividing society. And this I find very kind of a dramatic story, because before, the fact that people were not voting was normally interpreted that they're fine with the system. They don't have a need to participate for different reasons. Of course, the poor, particularly in the Western world, have been not very much encouraged to vote. But now you start to fear it. And I was reading recently a science fiction story written in 1952 by Isaac Asimov, which is called Franchise. And this tells the story of the American election that had to happen in 2008, by the way, the year in which Obama was elected. And this is how he imagines that the elections in the United States will go. They're going to be campaigns, they're going to be two candidates for president. And then on the election day, they're going to be one person, switch voter from switch state, that is going to be selected. They're going to be only one voter. And this one voter is going to talk to the computer, because this computer basically has managed to rationalize the preferences of different groups. And he's going to talk to the voter. The voter is not making a choice, by the way, but this is just a conversation to feel the atmosphere. It's something that you're looking. What is interesting about this model? This is an elections without the winning party. You elect a candidate, but you keep the victory out of it. And I'm saying this because this kind of a victory, obsession with victory, victimhood, which gives you identity these days, in order to have an identity, you should say that you're a victim of something. We have a victimhood Olympics. If you're listening to President Trump, he is the ultimate victim of the American system. This is also a strange change. Normally, before you're going to people and trying to convince them that you're winning, that you're kind of doing fine, that you're succeeding. Now, in order to be elected, you should be the victim. And this idea of identity and victimhood, in my view, is very strong. And this is also creating something, and this is my last point about the future. During the Cold War, all these parties, all the identities was based on the future. Everybody is telling how it's going to be in 30, 50 years, and both sides claimed that future belongs to them. Now, even if you see about the progressive groups, all the talk about social justice is a backward looking. I'm telling you that I'm going to redress certain things that have happened in the past. Nobody comes with the idea of a common future in which we're going to do things together. So from this point of view, in my view, depolarization is impossible if you're not going to have this idea of a common future, because it's not that it happens, but this is where you're depolarizing, where you're imagining that we're doing differently and we're going to do it better and this and that. And probably this is changing from this point of view, while electoral system probably matter how certain trend is going to be, for sure. History matters, by the way, the ethnic composition of society obviously matter. The crisis of a totally ethnically homogeneous democracies is different than people with much more ethnically diverse societies. But at the end of something like this is a common crisis of identity that tries to solve, I want the politics to solve my problem that I don't know exactly who I am, what I want to achieve in the world. And then politics became so personal that you cannot compromise anymore. And the only way to solve this is to send somebody in prison, because at least there, he's not going to bother you.
If I could just add on depolarization, following from that, we think depolarization would be a good thing, but actually the path to it might be very dangerous. As you say, a common enemy is in some ways the only visible path in the United States to depolarization. People thought COVID might be a depolarizing moment. Turned out it fell into the gears of polarization. So we had, signs up outside a diner in Tennessee that said, if you wear a mask here, you will likely be shot. So, that kind of nice approach to nice compromise politics on COVID policies. So that fell into the gears. But where is United States politics not polarized right now? Policy towards China. It's the one thing on which the Republicans and Democrats, they're fully in agreement with each other. They pretend they're not, but they are. They're pursuing the same policies. Because during the period of the Cold War, US politics there was a framework, an anti-Soviet framework. There were arguments about soft and hard policies towards the Soviet Union, but there was a framework. And once you lifted that framework off in the early 1990s, in came Newt Gingrich, the Contract in America, and the new intensity of politics. It was sort of like, now we can be trivial because we don't have an existential threat. So let's be really trivial and impeach Bill Clinton over whether or not he lied about the kind of sex he had with Monica Lewinsky or not. Let's just go right into triviality because we don't have anything big to do anymore. We can just mess around in the sandbox of politics because nothing big is going on. So oddly, the only, or what I see as one of the few plausible paths towards depolarization in the United States is sort of the growing intensity of a conflict with China, which somehow puts guardrails on the political system, forces people in the same room to compromise politically on certain things and realize we do have something in common because there's this out there. But that could be quite ugly in other ways. If that's the dynamic you need to depolarize, that makes you a dangerous player internationally and a divisive one in certain ways. So depolarization it's not just people singing Kumbaya together in a bridge building workshop and realizing they're all Americans and they should like each other. It could come about in a very different way.
So I think we demonstrated that these people can have a conversation without pretty much any intervention. But I'd suggest to have a few questions from the floor. And I was told that there were going to be microphones, but let me.
Yes, fascinating discussion, needless to say. Nevertheless, I've said it. To something that may be unique about the US system, does it play a role as well? Which has always struck me is the fact that our election cycles, or the US election cycle, is every 2 years. Whereas I'm not aware of any other country that is compelled to have elections so frequently. Does this then force the political parties always to be, or for a longer period, in a campaign mode and not a governing mode? And two, what makes the US campaign period so long? I believe in a European country, if an election's called, it's a couple of weeks at most, whereas in the US, you have the elections running for months or better part of a year.
Politics in the United States is a form of entertainment. It's so much more entertaining than politics in most European countries, which is so dull by comparison. A British journalist had a great little article about how entertaining politics was in the United States. And he said, and the fun thing is in the United States, it's not even the person who gets the most vote who wins. It's like this complicated system that you have to study. It's just so much more interesting than Britain, he said, where we actually just count the votes and that person wins the election. You Americans just make it so much more complicated and fun. Politics is entertainment because we crossed the line at some point in the 1960s and 70s into the merging of kind of cultural warfare and political competition, and politics became the battle of political symbols. I remember when Ronald Reagan was nominated, I remember sort of trying to get my head around the idea a television actor would become the most powerful person in the world. What European country at that time was putting a television actor up for incumbency? It wasn't until Berlusconi that Europe really started going down that road. And even then hasn't really, gone down that road very much in most cases. So the United States crossed a threshold of making politics into entertainment. And I don't say that in a light way. It's entertainment in a deeper way because it's about culture wars. The political figures are always, whom do you most want to sit down with and have dinner with is your choice of president, as opposed to who represents your interests and might most effectively advance them. It's kind of what's the one you feel like you'd like to have a bromance with. And so the United States has gone down this road in a really deep way. And the continual electoral cycle, as you described, every 2 years contributes to that. But even without it, presidential campaigns are about 2 years long now. And for Americans, governing is so boring. And politicking is so fun. The newspapers just already, I was, reading the New York Times today on the train. I was coming up from Budapest, and it's like, oh, here's the story on the different Republican challengers to Trump. There will be, 496,000 such stories over the next 2 years. Should I read this one? Can I wait 6 months to read that? Do I have to start reading it now? But I'm supposed to be an informed person on politics. I better read it and find out whether Marco Rubio has any chance. I get sucked into this because you can't, and so there's this continual politicking that has become politics. And governing is like a kind of minor thing over here, because governing is pretty dysfunctional in any way. Most of it can't get done. So politicking is so much more interesting. So every 2 years election is just one part of something much deeper in American politics, about politics as entertainment, politics as cultural warfare, and so forth.
But also money. Money. Because there's so much money being spent on politics that you can keep it. In Europe, we still don't have this money. So how you're defining this, because in order to keep all this machine running, in a certain way, everywhere else, political consultants is a seasonal work. In America, it's a full-time job. No, but this is very important because you go from elections to elections. And from this point of view, funding of the campaigns, in my view, quite important. But talking about entertainment and the difference between England and the US, in the beginning, in 2008 or 9, there was an interesting study comparing people who were interested in politics and people who follow this Big Brother show. So your post Big Brother. So there was a television show in which some people are staying in a room. They're talking, it was very important television product back then. And it appeared that people are much more identifying with the Big Brother show than with politics. Because the other problem in politics is that you do not have a cultural representation. For example, around probably 60% of the Bulgarian population has not graduated universities. But all members of the Bulgarian parliament has graduated universities. So from this point of view, you are never going to hear in the parliament somebody who does not speak, who speaks like you, or you're going to hear something which is worse, which means a PhD person who believes that he speaks in the way he imagines a non-educated person speaks, which is entertaining on its own. But this lack of cultural representation is also becoming extremely important. And this is where was part of the strengths of the populist parties who said, and for me, this was interesting. People said, oh, they're like fascists or communists. This is not true. Both fascists and communists didn't like the people in the way they were. They wanted to make them different projects, but they want to make them different. It was a pedagogical project. What is interesting about the populism, and here I do believe Trump was great, he was saying, I like you in the way you are. I don't want to change you. You're great. I like you in the way you are. So from this point of view, politicians start to act like waitresses. You're pleasing the people in a very intensive way.
Let's try another question and see how they do. Yes.
Thank you so much for the presentation. My name is Pavel. I'm a student here at the CEU at the Department of Public Policy. And my question has to do with the increasingly global nature of the challenges, because from what I've heard so far, you mentioned that the right-wing liberal parties in the European Union and the US are quite different. And with the increasingly global nature of conflicts, to name a few, the energy crisis, the war in Ukraine, we all hear about these. Is there any common ground for right-wing parties in the US and in the EU to produce any consensus to respond to these global challenges? Or are we more or less on the track to a more fractured right-wing society? Yes, in plural, because recently the US passed a way to support the electric cars manufacturing, which is EU pretty worried about. So this is just to introduce a brief context. So I imagine, will we see more things like these in the future or not? Thank you.
Yeah, on the U.S. conservative scene, global challenges are to be solved by greater national independence and combativeness. And so energy independence is one of the biggest, greater domestic production of oil and gas is response to climate change. And other global challenges are keep people out of the country because they may be dangerous and so forth. There is not a transnational cooperation agenda on the right in the United States. There's an anti-multilateral pro-economic protection and economic independence agenda. The United States is big enough that it can imagine trying to make that the solution to a lot of things. If you're in Belgium and you think the Belgian energy industry is not going to solve all of Belgium's energy issues, whereas in the United States, the capacity of the country allows certain elements of the country allow a kind of a view of transnational cooperation, which is it's actually the wrong idea because it puts our country second. That's where Donald Trump spoke to people's anxieties and said they're cheating us. We've been as you said, we've given so much to the world and gotten so little back, which made so many people around the global South fall over backward in their chairs, gasping for air, is the thought that the United States had been just so benevolent to them over the last 60 years that the United States was owed so much by them. Yet that idea sold politically to a lot of people in the United States.
In my view, also, you can see the progressive and conservatives basically betting on two very real sides of democracy. Democracy is about inclusion, but also about exclusion. The most important border is between citizens and non-citizens. So what the conservatives are saying is that the progressives are saying two things which are scandalous. One is that they're going to care about everybody. So if they're caring about everybody, they don't care about you. And you're representing them. And secondly, they're saying, progressives are saying, we're going to care about the most vulnerable. And then comes the story, but I'm the most vulnerable. And I'm the most vulnerable because you never can understand how difficult is my life because you're never interested in this. And this is very important. I was seeing this very much, particularly in the places I know best, in which it is not that you do not have a sympathy for some people suffering, but what you're never going to tolerate is if your own politician is going to tell you that somebody is more vulnerable than you. Be a poor kid in Africa, be a refugee from war, because it means that he does not understand how badly you're living. And in my view, this is very strong. It goes in a very different societies. And this is where the conservative politicians play the exclusion. Trust me, because I care about you. I don't care about everybody. And this is America first means that only when I declare that I'm not caring about anybody else, you should trust me. And this is what democracy is about.
Yes, thank you. I would like to refer my question to Ivan Krastev, since you were talking about the idea of future for populists. And I was thinking about whether there is actually a division between West and East in Europe, since Eastern Europe, after the fall of Cold War, people had an idea that they will become a much better society after all, and 30 years have passed, but we see actually there's still in many of these countries a soar of populist support. And actually, can we say that actually the Europe is divided by that sense, that there is actually populist parties who are making a popularity on this disappointment actually from the people, and that's actually maybe something that also divides Europe, as well as actually Europe and the US has differences between populist parties. Thank you.
Yeah, totally. No, listen, there is a general trends in the crisis of democracies, but they're very specific in very different places. Basically, you cannot easily, and Tom Carothers come with this beautiful story showing that you cannot just tell one story that is going to explain everything, even on the level of economic suffering. Yes, European and American middle class have been losing money and status, but it was not the case in the global south. And nevertheless, in India, you're going to see many things that we have been discussing here. So from this point of view, obviously there is something deeper, but in East European case, for sure, there is this type of a story in which first you have the feeling, rightly or wrongly, that in 10, 15 years, you're going to live like in the West. By the way, when you're thinking like in the West, this is how you believe that they're living in the West, because most of the people have not been there before. And there was nothing more attractive than something that you have not seen. Secondly, when this does not happen, you start to have a different kind of an explanation, and you can decide to blame yourself, but it's much easier to blame somebody else. And then the idea is that, yes, you said, we then believe that West is the future, but now we're understanding that we are the future. And for example, Prime Minister Orban make it very clear. This was the statement. He said, East is the future. So you're trying, and for me, and I've been making this argument before, is the problem with East European societies and some of the populist government in the regions is psychologically not very different than the problem with the second generation of migrants. Because what the Eastern Europe did, we collectively migrated to the West on the level of institutions and so on, also physically. And as a result of it, the first generation is very much kind of seen as a success, being like the other one. But the second generation, those who are studying basically migration, they start to have the feeling of a lost identity. They have the feeling that they are treated as a second-class citizens. And the best example of this is the famous Nutella scandal in Eastern Europe. No, but this is very important. Listen, it looks idiotic. I'm going to tell you what is the scandal. Suddenly, it was discovered that the taste of Nutella in the supermarkets in Bratislava is different than the supermarkets in Vienna. And this is true. It was different. And then comes the explanation. But simply, the producer said, we are trying to make it basically to fit what we believe is the local taste. The political big issue which was made out of this is we're treated like a second-class citizens. They're putting a much worse elements and so on. You have nutrition for the West and Nutella for the West and Nutella for the East. So from this point of view, obviously, there was not a big politics behind it. But this is, you go on the level of sensitivity. And this is the problem of the victimhood, because in a certain way, the first generation wants to be successful. And if you listen to East European politics of the first 10, 15 years, they're going to play the politics of pride. We did it. For example, Poland was the only country without recession in 2008-9. We are doing very well. We are doing best. And suddenly the idea is, we are bad. And just to give you one example how this identity politics is also contradictory. As you know, the current Polish government is not particularly progressive in the American sense. So they do not have very much sympathy with the claims of, for example, African Americans about the reparation, about slavery. But in the middle of the war, they came with a reparation against Germany for the World War II. This is in the middle of the war in which Germany is your ally. So suddenly, this kind of identity politics goes and is very much used by people who are spending the previous 2 hours attacking the American type of minority politics. So having majority groups starts to behave like persecuted minorities. This is what I see very much at the heart of some of this right-wing populism. And you're right, it is based also on absolutely real experiences of people losing, not simply losing incomes, but losing perspective, losing the idea that you're going to make it. So, yeah, it's there is a great Swiss joke. There are not many Swiss jokes that you know about three guys who are discussing where the babies come from. And the German boy said that it's an 8, 9-year boy discussing this. He said they come from the sky. And then comes the French boy who said, no, they come from the bedroom. And then the Swiss boy became very nervous. And he said, do not generalize. It's different from canton to canton. So with populism, I do believe we're on a Swiss line.
I think we reached the end of our group here. I would like to thank both Carothers and Ivan Krastev for this wonderful evening. I would also like to thank my colleagues Leah Buhela, Attila Halász, and online Robert Németh, who made this event possible. If you would like to join us for our next public event on what to do with the current lack of trust in democratic institutions and how to boost participation in democracy, please join us on the 1st of December on Democracy Day in a German-speaking event that is co-organized by CEU, the Wiener Zeitung, and Sora. If you are interested in what's next after the Brazilian elections for Brazil, the Americas, and the world, then please join the DI's online discussion next Tuesday at 6 p.m., where we are going to discuss those questions with Brazilian experts. And I'm assuming that if that door opens, there is a reception that's waiting for us. Thank you very much.
relationship between amount of GDP and success of how the determining factor is